The summer of 1992 arrived in Millbrook, Kentucky, like a heavy blanket, thick with humidity and the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. This small town of barely 800 souls sat nestled between rolling hills covered in tobacco fields, where the morning mist clung to the valleys like secrets waiting to be told. Rebecca Ann Holloway was 23 that summer, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight and freckles scattered across her nose like constellations. She had returned home after graduating from Eastern Kentucky University with a degree in elementary education, carrying dreams of teaching in the very classrooms where she had once sat as a child. The local school board had already offered her a position for the fall semester, and Rebecca had accepted with the enthusiasm of someone ready to give back to the community that had shaped her. Main Street in Millbrook stretched for only 6 blocks, lined with brick buildings that had weathered decades of Kentucky summers and winters. Murphy's General Store anchored one end, its wooden steps worn smooth by generations of customers, while the First Baptist Church stood sentinel at the other, its white steeple piercing the sky like a prayer made visible. Between them lay the heart of a community where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and rumors traveled faster than the morning paper. Rebecca lived with her parents, Harold and Dorothy Holloway, in a 2-story farmhouse painted butter yellow with white trim. The house sat on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from the center of town, surrounded by a picket fence that Harold painted fresh every spring. A tire swing hung from the massive oak tree in the front yard, a remnant from Rebecca's childhood that she couldn't bring herself to ask her father to remove. Every Tuesday and Thursday that summer, Rebecca drove the 20-minute route to Lexington in her powder blue 1989 Honda Civic, taking graduate courses that would enhance her teaching credentials. She had established a routine as predictable as the sunrise. Leave the house at 7:30 in the morning, stop at Murphy's for coffee and a blueberry muffin, wave to Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, who always sat on her porch reading the morning paper, and return home by 4:30 in the afternoon. The townspeople had grown accustomed to seeing Rebecca's Honda puttering down Main Street twice a week, her red hair flowing through the open windows because the air conditioning had broken in May, and Harold kept promising to get it fixed next week. She would honk at familiar faces, stop to chat with old teachers who praised her for following in their footsteps, and always, without fail, bring her mother a small bouquet of wildflowers she picked from the roadside on her way home. Tuesday, August 11th, 1992, began like any other. Dorothy Holloway would later remember every detail of that morning, with the crystal clarity that trauma burns into memory. Rebecca had come downstairs wearing a yellow sundress with small white flowers, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, secured with a scrunchie that matched her dress. She kissed her mother's cheek, while Dorothy packed her luncher turkey sandwich, apple slices, and a thermos of sweet tea. "I'll be home by 5 today," Rebecca had said, gathering her books and the canvas bag she used for her teaching materials. "Professor Mitchell wants to discuss my lesson plan for student teaching." Harold was already in the tobacco fields, checking the crop that would determine whether the Holloway family had a good year or a lean one. He didn't see his daughter leave that morning, a fact that would haunt him for decades to come. The last person to see Rebecca in Millbrook was Murphy at the general store, who handed her the usual coffee and muffin, while she chatted about the weather and her excitement about the upcoming school year. She seemed happy, Murphy would tell investigators later. Real happy. Talked about how she wanted to decorate her classroom with butterflies and rainbows. Said kids learned better when they felt like they were somewhere special. The drive to Lexington took Rebecca through winding country roads that cut through horse farms and cornfields, past weathered barns and farmhouses, where families had lived for generations. State Route 60 was her usual path, a ribbon of asphalt that connected the small-town world she knew to the larger world she was preparing to navigate as an educator. Rebecca's graduate class that day was educational psychology, held in a cramped classroom on the 3rd floor of the education building. Her professor, Dr. Janet Mitchell, would later recall that Rebecca had been particularly engaged during the discussion about learning disabilities in young children. She had raised her hand several times, asking thoughtful questions about how to adapt teaching methods for students with different needs. She had a natural instinct for teaching, Dr. Mitchell remembered. You could see it in how she spoke about children, how she lit up when we discussed classroom management techniques. She was going to be one of the good ones. After class, Rebecca had indeed met with Professor Mitchell to discuss her student teaching placement. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering everything from lesson planning to classroom discipline. Rebecca left the education building at 3:15 that afternoon, carrying her canvas bag and a stack of photocopied articles about childhood development that Dr. Mitchell had given her to read. Several students from her class saw Rebecca walk to the parking lot, where her powder blue Honda waited in the summer heat. She waved to a classmate named Jennifer Walsh, who was getting into her own car 2 spaces away. That wave, casual, friendly, accompanied by Rebecca's bright smile, would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. The Honda was found the next morning. It sat in the parking lot of a rest stop along State Route 60, about halfway between Lexington and Millbrook. The car was unlocked, the keys dangling from the ignition as if Rebecca had simply stepped away for a moment and planned to return. Her canvas bag lay on the passenger seat, the photocopied articles scattered across the floor as if they had been hastily searched through. Her thermos of sweet tea, still half full, sat in the cup holder, beads of condensation long since evaporated in the August heat. But Rebecca was nowhere to be found. Harold Holloway had started worrying when 5 o'clock came and went without his daughter's cheerful voice calling, "I'm home," from the front door. By 6 o'clock, Dorothy was pacing the kitchen, glancing out the window every few minutes for a glimpse of blue paint coming down Elm Street. At 7 o'clock, Harold called the Kentucky State Police. Maybe she had car trouble, the dispatcher suggested. Young folks sometimes lose track of time when they're visiting with friends, but the Holloways knew their daughter. Rebecca was responsible to a fault, the kind of person who called if she was going to be even 15 minutes late. When 8 o'clock arrived and the phone remained silent, Harold and 3 of his neighbors climbed into pickup trucks and began driving the route to Lexington, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness as they searched for any sign of the powder blue Honda. They found nothing that night. The next morning brought Trooper Daniel Cassidy to the Holloway farmhouse on Elm Street. He was a veteran of the Kentucky State Police, a man who had delivered bad news to families before. But something about the yellow house with its white picket fence and tire swing made him hope this would be different. He knocked on the front door at 8:30 in the morning, hat in hand, while Harold and Dorothy clung to each other in the living room that still smelled like the coffee Rebecca had made the day before. "We found her car," Trooper Cassidy said simply, "but we haven't found Rebecca." The rest stop where the Honda was discovered was a lonely placer, small gravel lot with a single picnic table and a rusted information sign about local wildlife. Truckers sometimes used it to rest during long hauls, and travelers occasionally stopped to stretch their legs. But it was not the kind of place a young woman would choose to linger alone as evening approached. The Kentucky State Police processed the scene with the methodical thoroughness that major crimes demanded. They dusted the car for fingerprints, finding only Rebecca's own prints on the steering wheel, door handles, and gear shift. They photographed the scattered papers, bagged the thermos for testing, and interviewed every person they could find who had traveled State Route 60 on the afternoon of August 11th. But physical evidence told them little, and witness accounts told them less. A truck driver named Pete Morrison remembered seeing a blue car at the rest stop around 4:30 that afternoon, but he hadn't paid close attention to the driver. A family from Ohio had stopped at the same rest area around 5 o'clock and noticed the car was still there, engine off, but they had been dealing with their own crying toddler and hadn't investigated further. It just seemed like someone had stepped away. The mother, Carol Preston, would tell investigators. "We figured maybe they were walking around or using the facilities. We never thought, ... We never imagined something was wrong." The facilities she referred to were a pair of concrete outhouses behind a cluster of pine trees, maintained by the county, but rarely cleaned. Police searched them thoroughly, finding nothing but the usual debris of a roadside stop, cigarette butts, food wrappers, and graffiti carved into the concrete walls by bored travelers. As news of Rebecca's disappearance spread through Millbrook, the small town transformed into something it had never been before, the center of a mystery that would grip not just the local community, but the entire region. Television crews arrived from Lexington and Louisville, their satellite trucks crowding Main Street and turning Murphy's General Store into an impromptu headquarters for reporters seeking interviews with anyone who had known the missing young woman. Dorothy Holloway, her face etched with worry and sleepless nights, made tearful appeals on the evening news. "Please," she whispered into the microphones that were thrust toward her. "If anyone knows anything at all, please help us bring our daughter home. She's all we have." She's everything to us. Single quotes. Harold stood beside his wife during these interviews, his farmer's hands twisted together, his eyes holding the hollow look of a man watching his world collapse, one day at a time. He had aged years in the space of a week, the lines around his eyes deepening with each sunset that failed to bring Rebecca home. The searches began immediately, and continued for weeks. Volunteers from Millbrook and surrounding communities combed the woods along State Route 60, their voices hoarse from calling Rebecca's name into the thick summer air. Dogs were brought in to track scents, their handlers leading them through fields and forests, while helicopters circled overhead, their pilots scanning the canopy for any glimpse of yellow fabric or auburn hair. Church groups organized prayer vigils on the steps of First Baptist, where Rebecca had been baptized as a child, and where she had planned to teach Sunday school in the fall. Candles flickered in the evening breeze, as voices rose in hymns that carried across Millbrook's quiet streets, reaching the Holloway farmhouse, where Rebecca's bedroom remained exactly as she had left it on that Tuesday morning in August. The investigation expanded beyond the simple facts of the missing car and the empty rest stop. Detectives interviewed Rebecca's classmates at Eastern Kentucky University, searching for any indication that she had been troubled, threatened, or involved in situations that might have put her in danger. They found nothing but glowing testimonials about a young woman who tutored struggling students, volunteered at literacy programs, and had never caused a moment's worry for anyone who knew her. She was the kind of person who would stop to help a stranger with a flat tire, said Jennifer Walsh, the classmate who had received Rebecca's final wave in the university parking lot. She believed in the goodness of people. Maybe that's what... Maybe that's what made her vulnerable. But vulnerable to what? To whom? These questions echoed through Millbrook as August turned to September, and the maple trees began their slow transformation from green to gold. Rebecca's teaching position at the elementary school remained unfilled, her classroom standing empty while her colleagues hung yellow ribbons on their classroom doors and held silent vigils during their lunch breaks. The Kentucky State Police widened their investigation, examining unsolved cases throughout the region for any patterns that might connect to Rebecca's disappearance. They looked into registered sex offenders, interviewed drifters and transients who might have been passing through the area, and followed up on every tip and sighting reported by well-meaning citizens who thought they had seen a young woman matching Rebecca's description. Every lead nowhere. Every hope dissolved into another dead end. Trooper Cassidy, who had become the primary investigator on the case, found himself driving past the Holloway farmhouse at odd hours, watching the lights in the windows and imagining the grief that filled those rooms. He had worked missing persons cases before, but something about Rebecca Holloway haunted him in ways he couldn't articulate. Perhaps it was her smile in the photographs, or the way her parents spoke about her dreams of teaching, or simply the cruel randomness of a life interrupted without explanation. As autumn settled over Millbrook, the media attention began to fade. Television crews packed up their equipment and moved on to other stories, other tragedies, other mysteries that demanded the public's attention. The yellow ribbons tied to trees and fence posts throughout the town began to weather and fray, their bright color slowly leaching away under the Kentucky sun and rain. But in the Holloway farmhouse on Elm Street, time had stopped on August 11, 1992. Dorothy continued to set 3 places at the dinner table each evening, removing the unused plate only when Harold's gentle touch on her shoulder reminded her that Rebecca would not be coming home for supper. Harold left the porch light burning every night, a beacon for a daughter who might yet find her way back to the yellow house with its white picket fence and tire swing. The powder blue Honda Civic was returned to the family after the police had exhausted every possible avenue of investigation it might provide. Harold parked it in the barn behind their house, covering it with a tarp like a tombstone for dreams that would never be fulfilled. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the weight of loss became too heavy to bear, he would walk to the barn and sit in the driver's seat, breathing in the faint scent of his daughter's perfume that still lingered in the fabric. Millbrook learned to live with the mystery, the way small towns learn to accommodate all manner of sorrows and secrets. Conversations would quiet when Dorothy Holloway walked into Murphy's General Store, and children would whisper as they passed the yellow house on their way to school, creating their own legends about the girl who had simply vanished into the summer heat of 1992. But mysteries have a way of refusing to stay buried, especially in small towns where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are harder to keep than promises. The official investigation might have grown cold, but in a place like Millbrook, Memory has a long reach, and truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. 3 decades would pass before the land itself would give up its secrets, and when it did, the revelation would shake Millbrook to its very foundations, proving that some disappearances are not random acts of fate, but carefully orchestrated silences that entire communities choose to maintain. The story of Rebecca Ann Holloway was far from over. It was simply waiting for the right moment to continue. The autumn of 1992 painted Millbrook in shades of amber and rust, but the beauty of the changing season felt like a mockery to those who continued searching for Rebecca Holloway. As the leaves fell from the oak trees lining Main Street, so too did the hope that she might simply walk back into town with a reasonable explanation for her 3-month absence. Trooper Daniel Cassidy had worked missing persons cases throughout his 15-year career with the Kentucky State Police, but none had consumed him quite like this one. His investigation had expanded far beyond the original crime scene at the rest stop on State Route 60. He had interviewed over 200 people, followed up on 67 reported sightings across 3 states, and pursued every lead with the methodical determination of a man who believed that answers existed somewhere in the maze of human behavior and circumstance. The command center for the investigation had been established in the basement of the Millbrook Community Center, a low brick building that usually hosted church potlucks and high school basketball games. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins that represented witness statement, search areas, and potential sighting. Red pins showed where Rebecca had been definitively seen on August 11th. Yellow pins marked unconfirmed sighting. Blue pins indicated areas that had been thoroughly searched by volunteers and law enforcement. The map was mostly blue pins now. Dorothy Holloway visited the command center every day, bringing coffee and homemade sandwiches for the investigators who continued working her daughter's case. She had lost 20 pounds since August, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink with each passing week. Her auburn hair, so similar to Rebecca's, had begun showing streaks of premature grey that she made no effort to hide. "Any news today?" she would ask Trooper Cassidy, the same question she had posed every morning for 3 months, her voice carrying less hope with each repetition. Cassidy always answered honestly, even when honesty felt like cruelty. "Not today, Mrs. Holloway, but we're not giving up." The truth was more complicated than his reassurances suggested. While the Kentucky State Police maintained an active investigation, resources were finite, and other cases demanded attention. The FBI had been consulted early in the investigation, but had found no evidence of interstate transportation or federal crimes that would justify their continued involvement. Rebecca's disappearance was becoming what law enforcement professionals euphemistically called a cold case, not officially closed, but no longer receiving the intensive daily attention that characterized active investigations. Harold Holloway dealt with his grief differently than his wife. Where Dorothy sought information and remained connected to the investigation, Harold retreated into the physical labor of farming, as if he could work hard enough to somehow bring his daughter home. He rose before dawn each morning and worked until well past sunset, tending to tobacco fields and livestock with an intensity that worried his neighbors. "He's working himself to death," Martha Henderson told her husband one evening as they watched Harold loading hay bales by the light of his truck's headlights. "That man is going to collapse if he doesn't slow down." But Harold found solace in the rhythm of farm work, in the predictable cycles of planting and harvesting that continued, regardless of human tragedy. The tobacco crop that year was exceptional, bringing prices that would normally have made the Holloway family celebrate. Instead, the extra money sat untouched in their bank account, as if spending it on anything other than finding Rebecca would be a betrayal of her memory. The organized search efforts had evolved as the months passed. The massive, coordinated searches of September, involving hundreds of volunteers and multiple law enforcement agencies, had given way to smaller, more targeted efforts, led by groups of Rebecca's friends and former classmates. Jennifer Walsh, the last person confirmed to have seen Rebecca at the university, had organized weekly searches throughout October and November, focusing on areas within a 50-mile radius of the rest stop where the Honda had been found. "We can't just stop looking," Jennifer told the dozen volunteers who gathered every Saturday morning in the parking lot of Millbrook Elementary School, the same school where Rebecca had planned to teach. "She's out there somewhere, and she needs us to find her." These weekend searches took on an almost ritual quality. Groups of college students and townspeople walking slowly through forests and fields, calling Rebecca's name into the November wind. They searched abandoned buildings, checked culverts and drainage ditches, and followed deer paths deep into woods, where sunlight barely penetrated the canopy of bare branches. They found nothing that brought them any closer to understanding what had happened to Rebecca Holloway. The Kentucky State Police had developed several working theories, none of them particularly encouraging for the family. The first possibility was stranger abduction. Rebecca had encountered someone at or near the rest stop who had taken her against her will. This theory was supported by the unlocked car and the scattered papers, suggesting that someone had searched through her belongings before abandoning the vehicle. The second theory suggested that Rebecca had been the victim of a crime of opportunity, possibly approached by someone who offered assistance when her car had mechanical problems. The fact that the Honda had started normally when police tested it contradicted this theory, but investigators knew that intermittent mechanical problems could occur without leaving obvious evidence. A third, more troubling possibility was that Rebecca had been targeted by someone who knew her routine, someone who had been watching and waiting for the right opportunity. This theory required investigators to look closely at Rebecca's personal life, her relationships, and anyone who might have harbored romantic or professional grievances against her. The investigation into Rebecca's personal relationships had been thorough and, for her family, deeply uncomfortable. Detectives had interviewed every young man she had dated, every professor who had taught her, and every employer who had hired her for part-time work during her college years. They had examined her phone records, her bank statements, and her personal correspondence with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspected criminals. What they found was a portrait of a young woman whose life was remarkably free of the complications that often led to violence. Rebecca had dated several men during college, but all relationships had ended amicably. She had no significant debts, no known enemies, and no involvement with drugs or illegal activity. Her professors described her as dedicated and well-liked. Her employers praised her reliability and positive attitude. She was exactly what she appeared to be, Trooper Cassidy wrote in one of his reports. A good person living a good life, which makes her disappearance all the more inexplicable. As winter approached, the character of the investigation changed once again. The focus shifted from active searching to following up on tips and sightings that continued to trickle in from across the region. A waitress in Tennessee was certain she had served coffee to a young woman matching Rebecca's description. A truck driver reported seeing someone who looked like her at a rest stop in Virginia. A store clerk in North Carolina remembered selling cigarettes to a nervous young woman with auburn hair who claimed to be traveling home. Each lead required investigation, each sighting demanded follow-up, and each dead end added another layer of frustration to an already complex case. Trooper Cassidy found himself driving hundreds of miles to interview witnesses whose memories proved unreliable, whose descriptions were too vague to be useful, whose certainty crumbled under careful question. The most promising lead came in early December, when a construction worker in Louisville reported finding a woman's purse in a dumpster behind a fast food restaurant. The purse contained a driver's license bearing the name Rebecca Holloway, along with $17 in cash and several credit cards that had not been used since her disappearance. For a brief moment, the discovery energized the investigation. Louisville was less than 2 hours from Millbrook, well within the range of someone who had taken Rebecca from the rest stop on State Route 60. The purse was processed for fingerprints and DNA evidence, while detectives canvassed the area where it had been found, interviewing employees and customers who might have seen something significant. But the forensic analysis revealed that the purse had been exposed to weather and waste for an extended period, making it impossible to determine when it had been placed in the dumpster. The fingerprints found on the leather and metal surfaces belonged to Rebecca, her parents, and several unidentified individuals whose prints were not in any criminal database. Most frustratingly, the location where the purse was found was serviced by a waste management company that collected garbage from dozens of businesses across Louisville, making it impossible to determine the original source. Harold Holloway drove to Louisville to identify his daughter's belongings, sitting in a sterile police conference room while detectives laid out the contents of the purse on a white table. He recognized the wallet he had given Rebecca for her 21st birthday, the small bottle of hand lotion she always carried, and the folded photograph of the family dog that she kept tucked behind her driver's license. "It's hers," he confirmed, his voice barely audible. "It's all hers." But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why would someone keep Rebecca's purse for months before discarding it? If she had been the victim of a robbery, why hadn't the cash and credit cards been taken? And most importantly, where was Rebecca herself? Christmas of 1992 arrived in Millbrook like an unwelcome visitor. The town's traditional holiday decorations went up as usual strings of lights on Main Street, a Christmas tree in the small park beside the courthouse, wreaths on the doors of businesses and churches. But the celebrations felt muted, as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for news that never came. The Holloway family declined invitations to holiday gatherings, unable to imagine celebrating anything while Rebecca remained missing. Dorothy had purchased Christmas gifts for her daughter in October before the reality of the situation had fully settled in, and she kept them wrapped beneath a small tree in the living room, their bright paper and ribbons serving as a daily reminder of hope deferred. On Christmas Eve, a candlelight vigil was held on the steps of First Baptist Church. Nearly 300 people gathered in the December cold, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of candles that flickered in the winter wind. Pastor James Crawford led the assembly in prayers for Rebecca's safe return and for comfort for her family during their time of unimaginable trial. "We do not understand why such things happen," Pastor Crawford said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "We cannot comprehend the purpose in such suffering. But we can choose to support one another, to remember together, and to never stop hoping for answers." Dorothy and Harold stood at the front of the gathering, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become their extended family during these months of anguish. Dorothy clutched a photograph of Rebecca, taken during her college graduation just 4 months earlier, when the future had seemed bright with possibility and teaching positions and wedding plans that would never come to fruition. As 1992 turned to 1993, the investigation entered a new phase that law enforcement officials were reluctant to discuss publicly. With no new leads and no evidence of Rebecca's whereabouts, the case file was transferred to the Kentucky State Police Cold Case Unit, a small department that specialized in investigations that had gone dormant but were not officially closed. Trooper Cassidy requested permission to remain involved with the case, even as his regular duties required him to focus on newer investigations. He had developed a personal investment in finding Rebecca Holloway that went beyond professional obligation, and he was not prepared to simply file away her photograph and move on to other cases. "Some cases get under your skin," he explained to his supervisor. "This is one of those cases. That girl deserves better than a filing cabinet." The cold case designation meant that active searching would cease, but investigators would continue following up on tips and new information as it became available. The command center in the community center basement was dismantled, its maps and photographs carefully packed away in boxes that joined the growing collection of evidence, stored in a climate-controlled warehouse in Lexington. For Millbrook, the transition from active investigation to cold case status marked a subtle but significant change in the community's relationship with Rebecca's disappearance. The daily presence of law enforcement officers and television crews had created a sense that resolution was imminent, that answers were just around the corner if everyone worked hard enough and hoped strongly enough. Now, with the media attention gone and the formal searches concluded, the town was forced to confront a more difficult reality. Rebecca Holloway might never come home, and life would have to continue in her absence. The adjustment was particularly difficult for Dorothy Holloway, who had structured her entire routine around the investigation. Without daily visits to the command center and regular conversations with Trooper Cassidy, she found herself with vast amounts of time to fill and no clear purpose to guide her days. She began volunteering at the elementary school where Rebecca had planned to teach, helping in the library and assisting with reading programs for struggling students. "It's what Rebecca would have done," she told Martha Henderson one afternoon as they organized books in the school library. She believed every child deserved help learning to read. Harold threw himself even deeper into farm work, expanding his operation to include cattle ranching and adding new fields of corn to supplement the tobacco crop. Neighbors whispered that he was trying to work himself to death, but Harold found that physical exhaustion was the only thing that allowed him to sleep at night without dreaming of his missing daughter. The town itself began to heal in the way that small communities do, slowly and with many setbacks, but with a resilience born of shared experience and mutual support. The yellow ribbons that had adorned trees and fence posts throughout Millbrook were gradually removed or faded into pale reminders of hope deferred. New families moved to town, bringing children who knew nothing of Rebecca Holloway except what they heard in whispered conversations among their elders. But healing did not mean forgetting, and in a town as small as Millbrook, Rebecca's absence continued to resonate in unexpected ways. Her former classroom at the elementary school remained empty for 2 years, before finally being assigned to a young teacher from Ohio who struggled to understand why students seemed reluctant to occupy certain desks, and why parents asked careful questions about her background and intention. The annual Millbrook Summer Festival, traditionally held in August, was moved to July, beginning in 1993, though organizers claimed the change was due to scheduling conflicts with other regional events. Everyone understood that the real reason was simpler. August would forever be associated with loss, and the community needed its celebrations to occur, at times not haunted by memories of what had been taken away. Jennifer Walsh continued organizing search efforts through the spring of 1993, but attendance dwindled as hope faded and participants moved on with their lives. By summer, the weekend searches had stopped entirely, though Jennifer continued driving the back roads of Kentucky on her own, windows down, calling Rebecca's name into the rural silence. "I know she's dead," Jennifer confided to her roommate one evening, after returning from another fruitless solo search. "I know she has to be dead, but I can't stop looking for her. It feels like giving up, and I can't give up on Rebecca." The one-year anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance was marked by a memorial service at First Baptist Church, attended by nearly everyone in Millbrook, and many friends from the university and surrounding community. Pastor Crawford spoke about the mystery of suffering and the importance of supporting one another through times of inexplicable loss. Harold and Dorothy sat in the front pew, holding hands and staring at a large photograph of their daughter that had been placed beside the altar. After the service, people gathered in small groups outside the church, sharing memories of Rebecca and offering continued support to her family. But the conversations carried an undertone of finality, an unspoken acknowledgement that this memorial service was not just a remembrance, but also a farewell, the community's way of accepting that Rebecca Holloway was not coming home. As the crowd dispersed and people returned to their cars and their Sunday afternoon plans, Martha Henderson noticed something that would stay with her for decades to come. While most of the congregation was saying goodbye and making plans for dinner, a small group of men stood apart from the others, talking in low voices near the church's side entrance. She recognized them all: Tommy Morrison, who ran the auto repair shop on Main Street; Dale Bradford, who worked at the grain elevator; Carl Stevens, who owned a small trucking company; and several other men who had lived in Millbrook their entire lives. What struck Martha as odd was not their presence at the memorial service. Everyone in town had attended, but their demeanor, while everyone else seemed sad but peaceful, as if the service had provided some measure of closure, these men appeared agitated, almost nervous. They kept glancing around, as if worried about being overheard, and their body language suggested they were arguing about something rather than simply paying their respects to Rebecca's memory. Martha mentioned the observation to her husband that evening, but he dismissed her concerns as the product of grief and stress. "People handle loss differently," he said. "Some folks get uncomfortable at memorial services. Doesn't mean anything sinister." But Martha Henderson had lived in Millbrook for 43 years, and she knew the rhythms and patterns of her community better than most. Something about that group of men and their secretive conversation outside the church struck her as wrong, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. Years would pass before Martha's instincts would prove correct, before the uncomfortable truth about that August day in 1992 would finally surface. But in small towns, memories are long, and secrets are hard to keep, especially when they involve the disappearance of a young woman whose only crime was driving home from college on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer. The second anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance came and went, with less public attention, but no less private anguish for her family. The third anniversary was marked only by a small notice in the local newspaper, requesting that anyone with information contact the Kentucky State Police. By the fourth anniversary, even those notices had stopped appearing, and Rebecca Holloway had officially become what she had always threatened to become: a memory, a mystery, and a wound that never quite healed. But in Millbrook, Kentucky, population 800 and declining, some wounds run deeper than others, and some secrets are too big to stay buried forever. The men who had gathered outside First Baptist Church that Sunday afternoon in August 1993 were about to learn that truth the hard way. The spring of 2018 arrived in Millbrook with an unusual warmth that coaxed the dogwood trees into early bloom and prompted farmers to plant their crops 2 weeks ahead of schedule. For most residents of the small Kentucky town, It was simply another changing of seasons, in a place where time moved at the pace of tobacco harvests and high school graduations. But for Martha Henderson, now 78 years old, and living alone in the house where she had raised 3 children, the spring of 2018 would bring an end to 26 years of wandering. The Henderson property sat on 12 acres at the edge of town, bordered by woods that had belonged to the family for 4 generations. Martha's late husband had always talked about clearing those woods to expand their small farming operation, but he had never gotten around to it before his death in 2015. Now, with her children grown and scattered across the country, Martha had decided to sell the property to a development company that planned to build a small subdivision of retirement homes. The surveyors arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, their trucks kicking up dust clouds as they navigated the narrow gravel road that led to the Henderson farmhouse. Martha watched from her kitchen window as 3 men in hard hats unloaded equipment and began the process of mapping the property boundaries, a necessary step before the land could be sold and developed. She had mixed feelings about the sale. The money would allow her to move into a comfortable apartment in Lexington, closer to her daughter and grandchildren. But it also meant saying goodbye to the place where she had spent most of her adult life. Every room in the farmhouse held memories. Every tree in the yard had been planted with purpose, and every inch of the property carried the accumulated history of decades of family life. The lead surveyor, a man named David Chen, who worked for a firm based in Louisville, had explained that the process would take several days. They needed to establish exact property lines, identify any wetlands or environmental concerns, and create detailed topographical maps that would guide the eventual construction. Most of the work would be concentrated in the cleared areas around the house and barn, but they would also need to survey the wooded sections to determine how much of the forest could be preserved in the development plans. It was while working in those woods, on a Thursday afternoon, when the spring sunlight filtered through the canopy of newly budded leaves, that David Chen made a discovery that would change everything. He was using a metal detector to locate old property markers, following a fence line that had been overgrown by decades of forest growth, when the device began emitting the steady beep that indicated metal buried beneath the surface. Chen assumed he had found another rusted fence post, or perhaps some farming equipment that had been abandoned years ago. But when he began clearing away the accumulated leaves and debris, he uncovered something that made him step back and reach for his cell phone. Partially buried beneath 2 decades of fallen leaves and forest growth was a small metal object that clearly did not belong in the woods. Chen brushed away more debris, revealing what appeared to be a compact mirror, the kind that women carried in their purses. The silver surface was tarnished and scratched, but when he held it up to the light, he could see an engraving on the back. To Rebecca, love Mom and Dad, Christmas, 1991. David Chen had moved to Kentucky only 3 years earlier, but he had heard the story of Rebecca Holloway. In small towns, mysteries like hers become part of the local folklore, stories that new residents learn, along with directions to the grocery store and the names of the best restaurants. He knew that a young woman had disappeared from Millbrook in 1992, and he knew that her case had never been solved. But he also knew that finding a single compact mirror in the woods did not necessarily mean he had discovered anything significant. The mirror could have been dropped by a hiker, lost during a camping trip, or discarded by someone cleaning out old belongings. The engraving suggested it had belonged to Rebecca Holloway, but without additional context. It was simply an intriguing artifact, rather than a breakthrough in a cold case. That context came when Chen decided to expand his search of the immediate area, using the metal detector to scan in wider circles around the spot where he had found the mirror. 20 feet away, beneath a fallen log that looked like it had been there for years, the metal detector registered another hit. This time, Chen found a tarnished silver bracelet with a small charm in the shape of a graduation cap, the kind of jewelry that might be given to commemorate finishing college. 50 feet in another direction, near a cluster of oak trees that formed a natural clearing, the metal detector revealed a third object, a small gold ring with a blue stone that had clearly been someone's high school class ring. Chen cleaned away the dirt and debris, squinting at the engraving on the inside of the band until he could make out the words, Millbrook High School, class of 1987. The surveyor sat down on a fallen log, his hands shaking slightly as he examined the 3 pieces of jewelry spread out on a clean cloth beside him. The timeline was becoming clear. Rebecca Holloway had graduated from Millbrook high school in 1987, and from Eastern Kentucky University in 1992. The compact mirror had been a Christmas gift from her parents just 8 months before her disappearance. The bracelet commemorated her college graduation. The class ring marked her high school achievement. These were not random pieces of jewelry lost by hikers or campers. These were Rebecca Holloway's personal belongings, scattered through the woods on the Henderson property, as if someone had deliberately spread them across the forest floor. Chen called the Kentucky State Police from his cell phone, standing in the dappled sunlight of the Henderson woods while he tried to explain his discovery to a dispatcher who seemed initially skeptical of his claims. It was not until he mentioned the engraving on the compact mirror that the dispatcher's tone changed, becoming more focused and urgent. "Sir, I need you to stay exactly where you are," the dispatcher instructed. "Do not touch anything else. Do not allow anyone else into the area. And do not move those items. We're sending investigators immediately." The wait seemed eternal. Chen sat on the fallen log, guarding the jewelry like a sentinel, while the afternoon sun tracked across the sky and the sounds of the forest continued around him. He called his office to explain that the surveying work would be delayed, and he called Martha Henderson to let her know that police would be arriving soon to investigate something found on her property. "What kind of something?" Martha asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who had lived through enough surprises to be suspicious of unexpected developments. "I think it might be related to that girl who disappeared years ago," Chen said carefully. "The police will explain everything when they get here." Martha Henderson hung up the phone and sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, staring out the window toward the woods where her children had played hide-and-seek decades earlier. She thought about the group of men she had seen talking outside First Baptist Church after Rebecca's memorial service, their nervous demeanor and secretive conversation. She thought about all the times over the years when she had wondered if she should have said something more, pushed harder for answers, demanded that someone investigate her suspicions. Now, it seemed, the woods themselves were providing the answers she had been seeking for 26 years. Trooper Daniel Cassidy arrived at the Henderson property 90 minutes later, accompanied by a crime scene technician and a detective from the Kentucky State Police Cold Case Unit. Cassidy was now a lieutenant, his hair gray, and his face lined by decades of difficult cases. But his memory of Rebecca Holloway remained as sharp as it had been in 1992. He had never stopped thinking about the young woman who had simply vanished from a rest stop on State Route 60, and he had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, answers would emerge. Standing in the Henderson woods, looking down at the 3 pieces of jewelry that David Chen had discovered, Cassidy felt a mixture of vindication and dread. Vindication because the discovery proved that Rebecca's disappearance was connected to Millbrook in ways that the original investigation had never established. Dread because jewelry scattered through the woods suggested a level of violence and premeditation that he had hoped never to confirm. "We need to treat this entire area as a crime scene," Cassidy told the technician, a young woman named Sarah Phillips who had joined the force 5 years earlier and had never worked a case this old or this complex. "We're going to grid search every square foot of these woods, and we're going to do it slowly and carefully. If there are 3 pieces of jewelry here, there might be more evidence we haven't found yet." The grid search began immediately and continued for 6 days, with teams of investigators working in careful coordination to examine every inch of the wooded area surrounding the Henderson property. They used metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains, even after decades of decomposition. What they found painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and horrifying in its implications. Over the course of the search, investigators recovered 17 additional items that had belonged to Rebecca Holloway. They found her car keys, which had been missing from the Honda Civic when it was discovered at the rest stop in 1992. They found her watch, a simple Timex with a leather band that her grandmother had given her for her 16th birthday. They found buttons from the yellow sundress she had been wearing on the day she disappeared, buttons that had been cut away from the fabric with surgical precision. They found her shoes white canvas sneakers with blue laces buried beneath a pile of rocks near a creek that ran through the back corner of the Henderson property. They found fragments of her driver's license, torn into small pieces and scattered beneath the roots of an ancient oak tree. They found the silver cross necklace she had worn since her confirmation at First Baptist Church, its chain broken and its surface scratched, as if it had been ripped from her neck. But they did not find Rebecca herself. The absence of human remains was both puzzling and ominous. The scattered belongings suggested that Rebecca had been brought to this location, probably against her will, and that someone had systematically removed and disposed of her personal effects. But where was she? Had her body been moved to another location? Had it been destroyed in some way that left no trace? Or was she buried somewhere on the property that the investigators had not yet searched? The search expanded beyond the Henderson Woods to include neighboring properties and the areas along the creek that flowed through multiple farms. Cadaver dogs were brought in from 3 different states, their handlers working in shifts to cover as much ground as possible while the scent trails remained viable. Ground-penetrating radar units scanned beneath barns, sheds, and outbuildings throughout the area, searching for any indication of disturbed soil or hidden graves. Martha Henderson watched the investigation unfold from her kitchen window, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that she struggled to understand. There was relief that answers were finally emerging after 26 years of uncertainty. There was horror at the realization that someone had used her property as a dumping ground for evidence of a violent crime. And there was persistent guilt, that she had never thought to search her own woods for signs of the young woman whose disappearance had haunted Millbrook for more than 2 decades. "I walked through those woods hundreds of times," she told Lieutenant Cassidy during one of their conversations. "I picked blackberries back there every summer. I walked my grandchildren through those trees when they came to visit. How could I have been so close to the truth for so many years and never known it?" Cassidy understood her anguish, but he also recognized that a casual walker would never have found evidence that had been deliberately hidden and had been buried beneath decades of accumulated forest debris. "You couldn't have known," he assured her. "Whoever did this chose this location because they thought it would never be searched." They were almost right. The discovery of Rebecca's belongings in the Henderson Woods fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. What had been a missing persons case was now clearly a homicide, even without the recovery of remains. The evidence suggested premeditation and local knowledge. Whoever had brought Rebecca to this location had known the area well enough to believe that the woods would never be thoroughly searched. More importantly, the location of the evidence pointed to someone with connections to Millbrook itself. The Henderson property was not visible from any major road, and accessing the wooded area required either permission from the family or knowledge of back roads and farm paths that only locals would possess. This was not the work of a passing stranger or a random redditor. This was someone who lived in the community, someone who had watched the search efforts in 1992 and had felt confident that this particular location would never be examined. As news of the discovery spread through Millbrook, the community that had spent 26 years learning to live with an unsolved mystery was forced to confront a more disturbing possibility, that one of their own had been responsible for Rebecca Holloway's disappearance and death. The reaction was swift and intense. People who had not spoken Rebecca's name in years suddenly found themselves revisiting memories and conversations from 1992, searching for details that might now seem significant in light of the new evidence. Neighbors looked at neighbors with fresh suspicion, wondering which familiar face might be hiding 26 years of guilt and deception. Lieutenant Cassidy established a new command center in the Millbrook Community Center, the same building that had housed the original investigation in 1992. He began the painstaking process of re-interviewing everyone who had been questioned during the initial investigation, armed now with the knowledge that Rebecca's disappearance was connected to the local community in ways that had never been suspected. The first person he contacted was Jennifer Walsh, Rebecca's former classmate who had organized the search efforts in the years immediately following the disappearance. Jennifer was now 49 years old, a high school principal in Lexington with children of her own. But her memory of Rebecca remained vivid and painful. "I always wondered if we were searching in the wrong places," Jennifer told Cassidy during their interview. "We spent so much time looking along the highway between Millbrook and Lexington, thinking that someone had taken her while she was traveling. We never imagined that she had been brought back here, to a place so close to home." The psychological impact of the discovery was particularly severe for Harold and Dorothy Holloway, now in their 70s and facing the confirmation of their worst fears about their daughter's fate. Dorothy had maintained a fragile hope for 26 years that Rebecca might still be alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or being held against her will, but still breathing, still hoping for rescue. The scattered belongings in the Henderson Woods shattered that hope with the finality of physical evidence. "At least we know now," Dorothy said, sitting in the same living room where she had waited for Rebecca to come home on that August evening in 1992. At least, we don't have to wonder anymore if she might walk through that door someday. But knowing brought its own form of torture. The evidence suggested that Rebecca had been murdered close to home, possibly by someone she knew, someone who had betrayed her trust in the most fundamental way possible. The young woman who had believed in the goodness of people, who would have stopped to help a stranger with a flat tire, had apparently been killed by someone who had exploited that very kindness. As the forensic analysis of the recovered evidence continued, additional details emerged that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Rebecca's final hours. The buttons from her dress had been cut away with a sharp blade, suggesting that she had been forced to remove her clothing. The broken chain of her cross necklace indicated a struggle. Most chillingly, several of the items had been damaged in ways that suggested they had been kept as trophies before eventually being discarded in the wood. The investigation was entering a new phase, one that would require investigators to look not just at what had happened to Rebecca Holloway, but at who in Millbrook had the knowledge, opportunity, and motive to destroy a young woman whose only crime had been driving home from college on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer. The answer to that question lay buried not just in the earth of the Henderson Woods, but in the memories and secrets of a small town that was about to learn that some truths are too terrible to ignore, no matter how long they have been hidden. The breakthrough came not from advanced forensic techniques or sophisticated criminal profiling, but from the simple act of a guilty conscience finally becoming too heavy to bear. 3 weeks after the discovery of Rebecca's belongings in the Henderson Woods, Lieutenant Daniel Cassidy received a phone call that would close one of Kentucky's most enduring cold cases and shatter the remaining illusions of a small town that had protected its secrets for 26 years. The caller was Martha Henderson herself, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination as she spoke into the phone from her kitchen. The same kitchen where she had watched the investigation unfold in her backyard woods. She had not slept well since the discovery, her nights haunted by memories and connections that she had spent decades trying to ignore. "Lieutenant Cassidy," she said, her words measured and careful, "I think I know who killed Rebecca Holloway, and I think I know why no one ever found her before now." The revelation Martha Henderson had to share was both simpler and more complex than anyone could have imagined. It was a story of small-town relationships, masculine pride, and a moment of violence that had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control. It was also a story of community complicity, of good people making terrible choices to protect someone they loved, and of how silence could become its own form of guilt. Martha's story began with her memory of that group of men she had seen talking outside First Baptist Church after Rebecca's memorial service in 1993. She had noted their nervous behavior at the time, but had dismissed it as awkwardness in the face of community tragedy. Now, with Rebecca's belongings found scattered through her own woods, she realized that their conversation had been about something far more serious than discomfort with grief. The men she had observed, Tommy Morrison, Dale Bradford, Carl Stevens, and 3 others were all part of an informal group that had been friends since high school. They hunted together, worked on cars together, and gathered most Friday nights at Morrison's auto repair shop to drink beer and talk about everything from farming to football. They were the kind of men who formed the backbone of small-town communities, reliable and respected, the type of people you called when you needed help moving furniture or fixing a leaky roof. But they were also men with secrets. And in the summer of 1992, one of those secrets had collided with Rebecca Holloway's life in a way that none of them could have predicted. Martha's information came from a source that took Lieutenant Cassidy by surprise, her late husband, Robert Henderson, who had confessed something to her on his deathbed in 2015 that she had been struggling with ever since. Robert had been peripherally connected to the group of men, occasionally joining their Friday night gatherings when his farm work allowed, and he had been present at Morrison's shop on the evening of August 11, 1992, when Tommy Morrison had arrived in a state of panic that none of them had ever seen before. According to Robert's deathbed confession, Morrison had burst into the shop around 8 o'clock that evening, his clothes dirty and his hands shaking, demanding that everyone stop what they were doing and listen to what he had to say. He told them that he had encountered Rebecca Holloway at the rest stop on State Route 60, where she had been having car trouble with her Honda Civic. Morrison claimed that he had stopped to help, as any decent person would do, but that the situation had somehow escalated beyond his control. He said that Rebecca had become frightened when she realized she was alone with a man she barely knew, and that her fear had triggered something in him that he couldn't explain or justify. He claimed that he had never intended to hurt her, that things had simply gone too far too fast, and that by the time he realized what was happening, it was too late to undo the damage. The details of Morrison's confession to his friends were fragmentary and unclear, filtered through Robert Henderson's imperfect memory and Martha's reluctant retelling. But the essential facts were chillingly simple. Tommy Morrison had killed Rebecca Holloway, whether intentionally or in a moment of uncontrolled violence, and he had brought her body to a location where he thought it would never be found. The choice of the Henderson woods was not random. Morrison had hunted those woods for years, with Robert Henderson's permission, and he knew them well enough to navigate in darkness. He also knew that the Henderson family rarely ventured into the deepest parts of their forest, preferring to stay closer to the house and barn where the terrain was more manageable. It was, in his desperate calculations, the perfect place to hide evidence of a crime that he could not undo. But Morrison had not acted alone in the cover-up. According to Robert Henderson's account, the group of men at the auto shop that night had made a collective decision to protect their friend. Even though they were horrified by what he had done, they helped Morrison clean up evidence, they provided him with alibis, and they maintained their silence, even as the investigation consumed their community for months. Their motivations were complex. Some were driven by loyalty to a man they had known since childhood. Others were motivated by fear of how Morrison's crime would reflect on their own families and reputations. Still others convinced themselves that Morrison's version of events, that Rebecca's death had been an accident, a tragic misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control, was something they could live with protecting. Dale Bradford, who worked at the grain elevator and had access to industrial equipment, had helped Morrison dispose of Rebecca's body in a way that would ensure it was never found. Carl Stevens, whose trucking company had contracts throughout the region, had provided transportation and logistical support. The others had contributed in smaller ways, providing false alibis, directing suspicion away from Morrison, and maintaining the conspiracy of silence that had protected him for 26 years. The plan had worked almost perfectly. Morrison had been questioned during the original investigation, as had most men in Millbrook who might have encountered Rebecca during her travels to and from the university. But he had been prepared with alibis and explanations, and nothing in his background suggested he was capable of violence against women. He was a respected businessman, a member of the community, someone whose word carried weight, with investigators who were looking for obvious suspects and clear motives. What the conspirators had not anticipated was that Morrison himself would become increasingly unstable as the years passed, struggling with guilt and paranoia that manifested in self-destructive behavior. He began drinking heavily. His auto repair business declined, and his relationships with family and friends deteriorated as he retreated into isolation and regret. By 2010, Morrison was essentially a hermit, living alone in a trailer behind his abandoned shop, avoiding contact with the men who had helped him cover up his crime. The Friday night gatherings at his shop had ended years earlier, and the group of friends who had once been inseparable had gradually drifted apart, each man carrying his own burden of guilt and fear. Tommy Morrison had died in 2016, 2 years before the discovery of Rebecca's belongings in the Henderson Wood. His death had been attributed to liver failure, brought on by decades of alcohol abuse, but those who knew him best understood that he had really died of shame and regret, poisoned by a secret that had consumed his life from the inside out. Lieutenant Cassidy listened to Martha Henderson's account with the mixture of relief and revulsion that comes with finally understanding a puzzle that has consumed years of investigation. Her information provided answers to questions that had haunted him since 1992, but those answers came at the cost of confirming that Rebecca Holloway had died alone and afraid, betrayed by someone who had pretended to offer help. The investigation that followed Martha's revelations was methodical and comprehensive, designed to corroborate her account and identify everyone who had participated in the cover-up. Cassidy and his team re-examined every piece of evidence from the original investigation, looking for connections they had missed and inconsistencies that now made sense in light of the new information. They discovered that Tommy Morrison's alibi for the evening of August 11, 1992, had been provided by Dale Bradford, who claimed that Morrison had been helping him repair a piece of equipment at the grain elevator. When investigators re-interviewed Bradford in 2018, armed with Martha Henderson's information, his story quickly fell apart, under careful questioning. Bradford, now 68 years old and suffering from the early stages of dementia, seemed almost relieved to finally tell the truth about that night, 26 years ago. He admitted that he had lied to protect Morrison, and he provided details about the cover-up that corroborated Martha's account of her husband's deathbed confession. "We thought we were helping a friend," Bradford told investigators, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Tommy said it was an accident, that he never meant to hurt that girl. We believed him because we wanted to believe him. But I've lived with it every day since then, wondering if we did the right thing, knowing we probably didn't." The interrogation of Carl Stevens was more difficult. Stevens was still operating his trucking company and had maintained his silence for decades, even after Morrison's death. When confronted with the evidence against him, he initially denied any knowledge of the cover-up, claiming that he barely remembered the events of 1992. But faced with Bradford's confession and the physical evidence from the Henderson woods, Stevens finally admitted his role in the conspiracy. He revealed that he had used one of his trucks to transport Rebecca's body to a remote location more than 100 miles from Millbrook, where it had been disposed of in a way that would ensure it was never recovered. Tommy was desperate, Stevens said during his confession. He said his life was over, that his family would be destroyed if anyone found out what had happened. "We made a decision to help him, and we've been living with that decision ever since." The other men who had been present at Morrison's shop that night were tracked down and interviewed, each one eventually admitting his role in the cover-up that had protected Tommy Morrison for 26 years. Some had provided false alibis. Others had helped dispose of evidence, or had simply agreed to remain silent about what they knew. All of them had carried the weight of their complicity for decades, watching Rebecca's family suffer while maintaining their conspiracy of silence. As the full scope of the cover-up became clear, Lieutenant Cassidy was forced to confront a disturbing reality about small-town justice and community loyalty. The men who had protected Tommy Morrison were not career criminals or sociopaths. They were ordinary people who had made an extraordinary decision to protect someone they cared about, even though they knew that decision would cause immeasurable pain to Rebecca's family and community. Their motivations were understandable, even if their actions were inexcusable. They had been faced with an impossible choice: turn in a friend and destroy multiple families, or protect him and hope that somehow the truth would remain buried forever. They had chosen loyalty over justice, and that choice had defined the rest of their lives. The legal consequences for the surviving conspirators were significant, but complicated by the passage of time and the death of the primary perpetrator. Dale Bradford and Carl Stevens were charged with accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice, charges that carried substantial prison sentences despite their advanced ages. The other men involved faced similar charges, and all of them ultimately pleaded guilty, rather than put Rebecca's family through the trauma of a prolonged trial. But for Harold and Dorothy Holloway, the legal resolution was less important than finally knowing the truth about what had happened to their daughter. They attended every court hearing, watching as the men who had stolen 26 years of their lives pleaded for mercy and forgiveness. Their presence was dignified and silent, a reminder of the human cost of the conspiracy that had protected Tommy Morrison for so long. "We always knew someone in town had to know something," Dorothy said after the final sentencing hearing. "You don't make a person disappear in a place like Millbrook without someone knowing something. We just never imagined it was so many people, staying quiet for so long." The revelation of the truth about Rebecca's disappearance had a profound impact on Millbrook itself. The community that had spent 26 years living with an unsolved mystery was forced to confront the reality that the mystery had been solved all along by people who had chosen to protect a killer rather than seek justice for his victim. Relationships that had survived decades were destroyed by the revelation. Families were torn apart as relatives chose different sides in the aftermath of the confessions. The Friday night gatherings and hunting trips that had bound the group of men together became symbols of a conspiracy that had robbed a family of their daughter and a community of its innocence. The First Baptist Church, where Rebecca had planned to teach Sunday school and where her memorial service had been held, became the focus of community efforts to make amends for the collective failure of justice. Pastor Crawford, who had led the memorial service in 1993, organized a new service in 2018, not just to remember Rebecca, but to seek forgiveness for a community that had unknowingly harbored her killers for decades. "We failed Rebecca," Pastor Crawford said during that service, speaking to a congregation that included many who had participated in the original searches and vigils. "We failed her family. we failed ourselves. We can't undo that failure, but we can acknowledge it and commit to ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again. The yellow house on Elm Street, where Harold and Dorothy Holloway had waited for their daughter's return for 26 years, finally found a measure of peace. The porch light that had burned every night since August 1992 was finally turned off, not because hope had died, but because hope had been transformed into knowledge, and knowledge had brought its own form of closure. Rebecca's remains were never recovered, despite the confessions and the detailed information provided by the conspirators. Carl Stevens led investigators to the remote location where he claimed to have disposed of her body, but decades of weather and development had altered the landscape beyond recognition. The exact location of Rebecca's final resting place remains unknown, a mystery within a mystery that may never be solved. But for her family and community, the most important questions had finally been answered. Rebecca had not run away to start a new life somewhere else. She had not been the victim of a random stranger or a serial killer passing through the area. She had been murdered by someone from her own community, someone who had exploited her willingness to trust and help others, and that murder had been covered up by people who valued loyalty over justice. The investigation officially closed in December 2018, 26 years and 4 months after Rebecca Holloway had driven away from her parents' house for the last time. Lieutenant Cassidy, who had worked the case longer than any other investigator, finally removed Rebecca's photograph from his desk and filed the case reports in the archives, where they would serve as a permanent record of a crime solved too late and justice delivered too slowly. In his final report, Cassidy wrote words that would echo through Millbrook for years to come. The disappearance of Rebecca Ann Holloway was not a mystery that couldn't be solved. It was a secret that too many people chose to keep. The difference between those two things is the difference between a tragedy and a betrayal. The story of Rebecca Holloway's disappearance became a cautionary tale about the price of silence and the danger of loyalty without boundaries. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most devastating crimes are committed not by strangers lurking in shadows, but by neighbors living in plain sight, protected by communities that choose comfort over courage. And in Millbrook, Kentucky, population now fewer than 600, Rebecca's memory lived on not just in the hearts of those who had loved her, but in the collective consciousness of a town that had learned, too late, that some secrets are too terrible to. The tire swing still hung from the oak tree in front of the yellow house on Elm Street, though Harold and Dorothy had moved to a smaller place in Lexington to be closer to their remaining family. New owners had painted the house white and planted different flowers in the garden, but neighbors still called it the Holloway place, and children still lowered their voices when they walked past, understanding that something sad had happened there, even if they didn't know exactly what. Sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, when the air was thick with humidity and the scent of tobacco fields, longtime residents of Millbrook would find themselves thinking about Rebecca Holloway, about the dreams she had carried, the children she would never teach, the life that had been stolen from her on a Tuesday afternoon in August 1992. And sometimes, in those moments of remembrance, they would ask themselves the question that had no answer: how many other secrets were hidden in their small town, waiting for time and chance to bring them to light? In the end, the silence spoke louder than any confession, echoing through the years with the weight of truth to long delayed and justice to long denied.